When we started researching wine tours from Florence, we kept seeing the same complaint in the reviews. Large tour buses arriving at the same vineyards, crowded tastings, and groups moving through wineries as quickly as possible. That wasn't the Tuscany experience we were hoping for. So instead of booking one of the big bus tours, we kept digging and eventually found a small group wine tour in the Chianti Rufina region that turned out to be one of our favorite days in all of Italy. If you search for Florence wine tours, you'll immediately see how many options there are. There are hundreds of tours with different prices, different group sizes, and very different experiences. So the first thing we did was start filtering, looking at travel ratings and reviews to see which tours consistently stood out. As we read through them, a pattern started to emerge. Many of the lower rated experiences mentioned large groups and crowded tastings. That's when we started looking specifically for a small group experience, which eventually led to Tuscan Trails. This particular tour stood out for a few reasons. First, the group size was capped at 8 people, which meant the experience would stay small. Second, our guide Todd was a sommelier, so the day focused not just on drinking wine, but actually learning about it. And everything was included. Transportation from Florence, visits to 2 wineries in the Chianti Rufina countryside, wine tastings, and a full Tuscan lunch, all for €180 per person. For us, that combination made the decision easy. It also had consistently strong reviews and came recommended on Rick Steve's website. The day runs about 8 hours, leaving Florence at 9:30 a.m. and returning around 5:15 p.m. The tour begins at Ponte alle Grazie, a bridge just a short walk from the Florence's historic center. We met the group there at 9:30 that morning. There were 7 of us in total, and our guide Todd drove us out of the city in a small Mercedes van. Within minutes, the buildings of Florence gave way to rolling hills and vineyards as we headed toward our first stop in the Chianti Rufina countryside. The drive to the first winery took about 35 minutes, winding through hills and vineyards. Even that short drive gives you a sense of how quickly Florence transitions into rural Tuscany. And then the castle came into view. Our first stop was Castello del Trebbio, a historic winery in the Chianti Rufina region. Parts of the castle date back to before the 12th century, and it sits high above the surrounding vineyards. In the 1400s, it belonged to the Pazzi family, the Florentine bankers behind the famous Pazzi conspiracy against the Medici family. In fact, the plot to assassinate Lorenzo the Magnificent and Giuliano de' Medici was planned here inside this castle. Standing there overlooking the vineyards while hearing that story was one of those moments where the history of Florence suddenly felt very real. After hearing that history, we headed inside for our first tasting. The wines here are organic, and the tasting included several Chianti Rufina wines along with olive oil pairings. One detail I really appreciated was that they provided gluten-free bread for the olive oil tasting, which is something I always notice when traveling with celiac disease. Todd guided us through the tasting, explaining the characteristics of the wines and how to recognize the different aromas. At one point, Nick leaned over and whispered that all he could smell was cheese, which was not exactly the tasting note Todd had in mind. But moments like that are part of the fun of learning. We spent about an hour and 20 minutes at the castle before heading to lunch.
It's just wine, and it lets the winemaker know the barrel's full.
Around 12:30, we left the castle winery and drove a short distance to Ristorante Artemide, where lunch was included as part of the tour. The restaurant is run by 2 brothers, one usually working the grounds while the other in the kitchen as the chef. Lunch was served family style, and by this point the group had settled in comfortably after spending the morning together. At one point, the chef came out, looked at the table, and scolded us for not eating enough. One of those perfectly Italian moments that felt like equal parts hospitality and tough love. For me, the highlight was the gluten-free gnocchi, which was excellent, always a win when traveling in Italy with celiac disease. We lingered over lunch for about an hour and a half, leaving around 2 before heading to the second winery. After lunch, we continued through the Tuscan countryside. About 50 minutes later, we arrived at our second winery of the day, Fattoria Selvapiana. Compared to the castle winery we visited earlier, this stop felt more like a working winery, with barrels stacked in the cellar and rows of bottles aging in the dark. We toured the production areas and cellars before sitting down for a tasting of 6 different wines. Unlike the first winery, there were no food pairings, so the focus stayed entirely on the wines themselves. Each place setting also had a wine dump bucket, which lets you taste the wines without needing to finish every glass, something that becomes pretty helpful by the end of a full tasting day. We spent about an hour and 40 minutes at Selvapiana, leaving around 4:30 to head back to Florence. The drive back to Florence took about 45 minutes, and we arrived back in the city around 5:15. Looking back at the day, the pacing felt really well balanced. We left Florence mid-morning, visited 2 very different wineries, enjoyed a long Tuscan lunch, and still returned to the city with the evening ahead of us. For couples, small groups of friends, or even solo travelers who want to experience Tuscany without renting a car, a small group tour like this works really well. This was one of our favorite days of the entire trip. After spending days enjoying wine throughout Italy, it was wonderful to finally understand a little more about what we were drinking, and experiencing that in the Tuscan countryside made it even more memorable. If you're planning time in Florence, would you take a day trip like this into the Tuscan countryside? I'd love to hear what you're considering.